This is the second video lecture on Keiji Nishitani's Religion and Nothingness. In the first video lecture, we saw him explaining the problem of contemporary nihility, how science kind of invalidates religion and even philosophy, opening up this abyss of nihilism, of meaninglessness, of nothingness. But what he says, though, is you have then the response, which is a religious, Western religious response, which embraces this kind of duality of object and subject. And then you have the kind of atheistic Western response of existentialism in the form of the philosophers Jean-Paul Sartre or Simone de Beauvoir, for example, that want to embrace this ambiguity of this duality of object and subject, or being and nothingness, right? Just embracing that dualism. And what Nishitani tried to argue is that there's something about that dualism in itself which just always is subsumed by nihility. And nihility in terms of a lack of meaning. That it doesn't successfully address this contemporary problem of nihility. So in this video lecture, we are going to see Nishitani's positive response to this problem, of how we can address this problem of nihility, and specifically by rejecting the duality of object-subject distinction, or being and nothingness distinction. Now, Nishitani says that Western thought conceives of nothingness as a pure negativity, and this is why it's called nihility. He does not refer to nothingness as nihility in a positive sense. And what this does then is it leads to a complete loss of meaning, because it's basically the absence of being, of existence. Now, Eastern, and specifically Buddhist, and even more specifically Mahayana Buddhist thought, their account of nothingness differs from Western nothingness, because it conceives of nothingness as shunyata, as a productive kind of emptiness. So, according to Buddhism, shunyata is the standpoint from which we become nihility at the foundation of ourselves and of all things. Because, remember, in Buddhism, there is no self. It's just a useful fiction. What Nishitani says is that what is at issue is rather the nihility we find opening up before us at the ground of self-existence when we take a stand there, a nihility that really stretches out like an abyss over which the existence of the self is held in suspense. The point here is simply that nihility is always a nihility for self-existence, that is to say, a nihility that we contact when we posit ourselves on the side of the existence of our self-existence. So let's unpack this. Shunyata, as emptiness or nothingness, is not a thing separate from us and the existence of all things. It is not like in the Western sense of nothingness or the Western sense of nihility, where again you have being, you have existence, and on the other hand, the absence of being or existence is a complete lack of being and existence. It is nothingness. Instead, what he says for shunyata as emptiness is being siv nothingness. It is together, being and nothingness are one and the same. Think about the self, okay? The Buddhists argue that there is no self, and yet conventionally there is a self. That out of the lack of a self, there arises moments, right? Momentariness. There arises moments of an experience of a self that's not really there. But if there were no self, there could not be these moments of an experience of a self. They go together. He says, it is in its original form self-emptying, that is, shunyata is. In this meaning, true emptiness is not to be posited as something outside of an other than being. Rather, it is to be realized as something united to and self-identical with being. So being and nothingness are not separate opposite entities that engage in a kind of dualism. Right? It would be wrong to think of, for example, the ultimate account of truth and the conventional account of truth as separate entities, separate conceptions of truth that in no way are related to one another. In fact, they are. Right? It is only because of an ultimate truth that there is conventional truth, and only because of conventional truth that there is ultimate truth. In the same way, it is only because there is being that there is nothingness, and nothingness that there is being. The illusion, though, is to think they're two separate things that maybe interact with each other, but really are in their natures distinct. That's not quite the case here. It's slightly dialectical, but really they're one and the same. Nothingness as shunyata is realized as something united and self-identical with being. In fact, Nishitani thinks that nothingness, that which unites all things, the great equalizer as he calls it, is the ground for the possibility of meaning. We'll look more at that in just a moment. But let's think about the meaningfulness of nothingness. So how can shunyata be something positive? How can nothingness be something positive? He says, viewed in terms of this process, shunyata represents the end point of an orientation to negation. It can be termed an absolute negativity, inasmuch as it is a standpoint that has negated and thereby transcended nihility, which was itself the transcendence through negation of all being. It can also be termed an absolute transcendence of being, as it absolutely denies and distances itself from any standpoint shackled, in any way whatsoever, to being. Emptiness can only appear as a self-identity with being, in a relationship of sieve, by which both being and emptiness are seen as co-present from the start and structurally inseparable from one another. Now, think about, again, the Buddhist argument that there is no self. The loss of self is the realization then of shunyata, right? When we have ego death and we realize there is no self, there is no you, there is no me, there's a collapse of the distinction between subject and object, of myself and yourself, of me and my cats, or of me and this glass of water here. What happens then is the boundaries between the personal and impersonal are dissolved. The boundaries between all things are dissolved. Nishitani says the abyss of emptiness opens up more to the near side, more immediately here and now, than what we call ego or subjectivity. Just as we overlook the cosmic sky that envelops us while we move and have our being within it, and stare only at the patch of sky overhead, so too we fail to realize that we stand more to the near side of ourselves in emptiness than we do in self-consciousness. Think about the ethics of Buddhism. When there is no self, that's when there is reason to care about the suffering of others. When there is not an ego where I can privilege my thoughts and my feelings over others, that's when I'm actually connected with others. Not when there is an ego, not when there is a real me. Because when there is a real me, that is when I am wholly distinct from anyone else. That's when I'm distanced from everyone else. But when there's a loss of self, that's when I'm one and the same as everyone else. So why are we not then immediately aware of the nothingness of our existence if it is the ground for the possibility of our existence? Well, think back to the phenomenological account, right, of the dog and the bread, or the cat and the mouse toy, or the human being and the glass of water, or whatever. Now, in this case, we talked about how the mind, specifically with human beings, is situated and practical. We're kind of taken up by our environment and kind of interacting one with it. There's a kind of everydayness that characterizes our experience. So Nishitani says in response to this question, it is simply because our everyday is all too everyday, because we get caught up in the conventionality of these things, right? We get caught up in the conventional truths. Because we're stuck in our everydayness, then we fail to pay attention to the reality of nihility. And yet, We know, based on looking at the concepts of the self, that and the concept of conventional truth and so on, that it is only because there's ultimate truth that there's conventional truth. That there's only because there is no self that there's the experience of a self. This seems contradictory, and yet, in a sense, it's a bit dialectical here. Now, nothingness is that essential encounter in which, according to Nishitani, when we are most distant from one another, we are the closest. When we are most distant insofar as there is no Austin, insofar as there is no you, and in that sense there seems to be nothingness, a kind of abyss that opens up, that's actually when we're the closest. Because when there is no self, then we are all treated the same. Think about this. To know something or to know someone, essentially, in the nature of what it means to know someone, does not refer to knowledge of the innermost heart of another person being. Because there really is no innermost heart. There is no true you that's unchanging, that persists throughout time. When we talk about knowing someone, when we know someone, it essentially, in its nature, it refers to an awareness of two separate things being at one and the same time, one as nothingness. Nishitani says, in contrast to the field of nihility, on which the desolate and bottomless abyss distances even the most intimate of persons or things from one another, on the field of emptiness, that absolute breach points directly to a most intimate encounter with everything that exists. Emptiness is the field on which an essential encounter can take place between entities normally taken to be most distantly related, even at enmity with each other, no less than between those that are most closely related. This encounter is essential because it takes place at the source of existence common to the one and the other, and yet at a point where each is truly itself. It is here that all things can encounter one another on a level of equality beyond distinctions of gratitude and revenge, free of differences between ill will and good. Indeed, it is even inadequate to speak any longer of an encounter. So we have here an absolute self-identity in which the one and the other are yet truly themselves, at once absolutely broken apart and absolutely joined together. If to know someone meant to know their innermost heart, that would be impossible. Because if there is a true self, then there is a clear distinction between one and another. And I could never put myself in your shoes. Now I can pretend to do so, I can imagine it, but I can never truly know it. But if there is no self, if there is nothingness, if there is shunyata, then I don't need to put myself in your shoes, because we're already one and the same in terms of our being as nothingness, in terms of our experience as things that exist, things that suffer because we desire. In that way, then, we are one and the same as nothingness, as shunyata. So here then we have an answer to the modern problem of nihility. We have, in the Western case, a personal God who is thought to reveal themselves from heaven down to earth and is considered to be seated beyond, on the far side of human existence here. This is why humans then are objectified in relation to the pure subjectivity of God. The abyss of nihility then refers to the near side, to the extent that it is represented as the sort of thing that we can look down and see open up at the ground beneath us, Nishitani says. Something of the far side remains present in it. It is as if we were looking down from a position on the earth to what lies under the earth. And we're going to see then what Nishitani is trying to argue is, again, this dualism. Flip it. Imagine they're one and the same. If you do so, then both the abyss of nihility and the personal relationship of God and humanity can come about and be represented in emptiness, as sameness, as both distinct and yet same, as both far and near, and present. Nishitani says to imagine it like a canvas painted on both sides. One side of the canvas is painted with images of heaven, and the other side is painted with images of earth. Imagine that, but where front and back appear as one. That is shunyata. That is how nothingness is the ground of being, of the possibility of all meaning at all. There is no duality of the near and the far side. There is just nothingness. And in nothingness, we find being. So here is a overview of the argument that Nishitani is offering. So I've put the argument together like this, where the first premise is that religion provides meaning in the face of lurking nihility. Remember, religion is that thing which originally gave purpose to one's life. Eventually, premise 2, you have the development of modern science and technology which seem to invalidate religion, which then reveals the closeness of nihility. Premise 3 then, nothingness as nihility is not a metaphysical substance. It is the negation of all being. In this we have this kind of negativity, both in a metaphysical sense and actually a moral sense, because it is valueless. Premise 4 though, nothingness as shunyata is actually the ground for the possibility of any meaning. So, what is revealed by premise 2 is premise 3. But premise 4 says that's not the only kind of an account of nothingness. Because shunyata is not a negation of metaphysical substance. It is actually the ground for the possibility of any meaning, of any being at all. So the conclusion then is that emancipation from the dread of nihility is achieved in recognition of the nothingness that grounds the possibility of all things. And again, Nishitani calls this the great doubt. He says the point at which emptiness is emptied to become true emptiness is the very point at which each and everything becomes manifest in possession of its own suchness. It is the field of essential disentanglement from the self-attachment spoken of earlier. In a word, it is the field of what Buddhist teaching calls emancipation. Shunyata, nothingness, is emancipation from suffering. It is transcendence of the duality, and it is that duality which brings suffering. Now, Nishitani is clearly offering a kind of account of individual human experience, both not obviously just individual, but collective human experience. And in a way, there's a kind of focus on an individual ethical outlook and how to find meaning for oneself. I think an interesting question, though, is how we can relate Nishitani's account of shunyata, of the positivity of nothingness, to a kind of social political approach to dealing with the contemporary problem of nihility and of alienation in society, related to technology and science. So I think an interesting question to think about is what practices towards technology and the social relations between us and then technology need to be changed in order to best realize shunyata in our everyday practices. And how should they be changed then? What kinds of practices should we advocate? I have here a picture of a bunch of people on their cell phones. I think this is an example of technology alienating ourselves from one another, bringing about a sense of purposelessness where we get lost in our phones. But I think there's a way to think about shunyata is not, right, it's not trying to blame technology. Technology isn't the source. It comes back to human beings. Human beings has nothingness because it's human beings who developed technology, human beings who developed science, human beings who are nothingness. And so I think it's interesting to think about what Nishitani is talking about, not as a way to say, well, technology is the problem or specific kinds of technology, but how we organize our lives, how we organize our relationships with one another, right? Connecting then the metaphysical critique of the self with an ethical outlook, trying to account for each other, trying to promote benevolence and well-being, and how then we might want to restructure society such that we recognize technology isn't the source of nihility. It's human beings. It's how they relate to one another. It's the social relations between us.